The world trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. From the frozen plains of Mongolia to the gates of Europe, the Mongol Empire moved like a storm of steel and fire. Entire cities vanished overnight. Kingdoms that once believed themselves eternal were reduced to ash. The people of Asia and the Middle East whispered one name in terror: the Mongols, the horsemen of the end of days. But imagine, what if no one could stop them? What if nothing stood between this unstoppable force and the heart of the civilized world? It was the 13th century, a time when the world seemed to be collapsing under its own weight. The Mongols had conquered the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, burned Baghdad to the ground, and crushed armies that outnumbered them 3-1. Their banners stretched from China to Hungary. Even the distant kings of Europe sent prayers, hoping the storm would pass them by. And yet, in the deserts of Egypt beneath the scorching sun, a new power was rising, one born not of bloodlines or noble houses, but of chains and rebellion. They were the Mamluks warriors, once sold as slaves, now masters of their own destiny. Among them stood a man named Qutuz, whose life read like legend. He had been stolen from his homeland as a child, sold in the markets of Damascus, and trained to fight, obey, and never question. But fate had other plans. When the Mongol threat crept closer, Qutuz rose through the ranks not by birthright but by sheer strength of will. His eyes burned with something the Mongols could not conquer: defiance. At his side was Baybars, a commander feared and respected in equal measure. Sharp-minded, fierce, and impossibly bold Baybars understood the Mongols better than anyone else. He had seen their methods swift, merciless, efficient, and he knew that only cunning could stand against such fury. Together, Qutuz and Baybars prepared for what the world believed impossible: to face the Mongols in open battle and win. But before the first arrow was loosed, before the clash of swords came, the silence, the kind that falls before a storm, Cairo was restless. The air itself seemed to tremble with fear and anticipation. Blacksmiths worked through the night, sparks flying like stars as they forged blades for men who might not live to see another sunrise. In the training grounds, soldiers rehearsed formations under the burning Sunday sweat poured from their brows, yet no one dared to falter. Qutuz walked among them silently, his armor plain, but his presence heavy with purpose. "We fight not for glory," he said in a low, steady voice, "but because no one else will." His words spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. In the shadows, Baybars observed the young recruits' boys who still shook when they held their swords. He knew fear was natural. The challenge was not to erase it, but to use it. He called out, his voice sharp as steel, "The Mongols bleed just as we do. Remember that when you face them." A murmur of courage rippled through the lines. Across the Middle East, the Mongol armies advanced with terrifying precision. Cities that resisted were wiped from the map. Those that surrendered were left in ruins all the same. Word of their coming reached Cairo like a chill wind. The people prayed. Mothers held their children close. Even the most faithful wondered if this was the end foretold in scripture. But Qutuz would not kneel. He gathered his generals beneath the torchlight of the citadel and spread a map before them, lines of sand and ink marking the fate of nations. His finger traced a valley in northern Palestine, Ain Jalut. "Here," he said quietly, "is where we stand." Baybars studied the map, a slow grin forming on his face. "A narrow valley," he murmured, "surrounded by hills. Perfect for an ambush." Qutuz met his gaze. "Then we make it their grave." Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, not from the heavens but from the hooves of advancing armies. The Mongols were coming, and as Cairo slept under a blood-red moon, the Mamluks sharpened their blades, whispering silent prayers to the night. Hope was a fragile thing, but sometimes the smallest flame can burn brighter than 1,000 suns. This was that moment. This was the spark before the storm. The spark had been lit. And soon the storm answered. Far to the north, beyond the dunes and the desert winds, the Mongol general Kitbuqa rode beneath banners soaked in dust and blood. His armies, seasoned veterans of Genghis Khan's legacy, had already crushed Baghdad, the beating heart of the Islamic world. Now the plains of Syria trembled under the rhythm of their hooves. Aleppo was the first to fall. The city walls, once proud and defiant, cracked under the relentless thunder of Mongol siege engines. Smoke poured from every quarter. The sky turned black. The cries of the dying echoed through streets once filled with merchants and scholars. To the people watching from their rooftops, it felt as if the world itself had ended. From there, the Mongols marched south, unstoppable, methodical, precise. Damascus, the jewel of the Levant, met the same fate. Flames devoured its markets, its mosques, its gardens. The scent of burning cedar mixed with the smell of iron and fear. Survivors fled toward Egypt, their faces hollow, their voices trembling with the same words over and over again. They're coming. In Cairo, the air grew heavy. Rumors traveled faster than truth. Every whisper carried the same dread: Baghdad has fallen. Aleppo has burned. Damascus is lost. Inside, the citadel torches flickered against the marble walls as the Mamluk council gathered in haste. Tension coiled through the chamber like a living thing. "They'll be at our borders within weeks," said one of the emirs, slamming his fist against the table. "We can't fight them. No one ever has." Another voice rose from across the room. "If we face them in open battle, we die. If we surrender, we still die. Tell us, Sultan, what do we do?" All eyes turned to Qutuz. He stood motionless, the weight of the entire kingdom pressing against his chest. His gaze swept over the faces before him: veterans, nobles, slaves, turned soldiers, men who had seen too much war and yet feared this one most. Qutuz's voice was calm, almost quiet. "Panic feeds the enemy before battle even begins. We will not feed them." The room fell silent. He gestured to a map spread across the table, a vast stretch of parchment marked with rivers and roads, valleys and plains. "They will come through Syria," he said. "They will seek the quickest route south. Here." His finger stopped at a narrow patch of green between the hills of Galilee. Ain Jalut. From the shadows, Baybars stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he studied the map. His hand traced the valley lines. It's narrow, hemmed in by ridges, perfect for cavalry maneuvers or a trap. Qutuz nodded. "Exactly." Murmurs spread through the council. One of the older generals scoffed. "You would lure them into open battle against them," Baybars turned sharply. "They're not gods," he said coldly. "They bleed." A spark of courage flashed in the eyes around the room. Still doubt lingered. One commander whispered, "If we fail, Cairo will burn like Baghdad." Qutuz met his gaze. "Then we make sure we do not fail." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one by one, the generals lowered their heads, not in fear, but in solemn agreement. Outside, the city stirred. Word of war spread through the streets. Mothers wept quietly as their sons polished their swords. Priests and scholars prayed side by side. Blacksmiths hammered through the night, sparks flying into the darkness like fireflies. Cairo was alive, but it beat with a nervous, unsteady heart. In the barracks, Baybars walked among the soldiers. His armor was dusty, his voice rough from command. He stopped before a group of young recruits, barely men. "When you see the Mongols," he said, "don't look at their numbers. Look at their eyes. They think the world belongs to them. Prove them wrong." The men nodded, gripping their weapons tighter. Later that night, as the moon hung low over Cairo, Qutuz stood alone on the balcony of the citadel. The city stretched beneath him like a sea of shadows and lanterns. The distant wind carried the faint echo of thunder, the sound of hooves perhaps, or maybe his imagination. Baybars joined him quietly. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Baybars broke the silence. "Do you ever fear them?" Qutuz exhaled slowly. "Every man fears what he does not understand. But fear can serve us if we remember who we are." He turned toward the horizon. "We were slaves once, now we decide our fate." Baybars's lips curved into a grim smile. "Then let's give history something to remember." Below them, Cairo slept uneasily, unaware that destiny was already in motion. Soon in the quiet valley of Ain Jalut, the greatest storm the world had ever seen would collide with the last wall still standing. Dawn broke over the valley of Ain Jalut, veiled in thick morning mist. The air was cold, still, and heavy, like the breath before a scream. Somewhere beyond the fog, tens of thousands of hooves shifted restlessly, and the faint jingle of armor cut through the silence. It was September 3rd, 1260, the day the world would change. Baybars sat atop his horse at the front of the Mamluk vanguard. His gloved hand rested on the hilt of his curved sword, his eyes scanning the pale horizon. The plan was simple, at least in words. Draw the Mongols into the valley, make them believe victory was already theirs, and then close the jaws of the trap. But war never cared for plans. He turned to his officers. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice a low growl, "when I signal we fall back. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear." One of the younger commanders swallowed hard. "And if they don't take the bait," Baybars smiled thinly, "then we make them believe it." From the opposite ridge, the dust cloud of the Mongol army began to rise, a moving storm of steel and fury. Kitbuqa, the Mongol general, rode at the front, his banner snapping in the wind. His men chanted in guttural unison, the sound rolling like thunder down the slopes. The first arrows came whistling through the fog. Baybars raised his sword. "Advance." The clash was immediate and brutal. Horses screamed. Steel tore through flesh. Arrows hissed like angry serpents. The ground shook with every impact. Baybars's men met the Mongols head-on, their curved sabers flashing like streaks of light through the haze. But this was only the beginning. "Pull back," Baybars shouted, wheeling his horse around. Now, to the Mongols, it looked like panic. The Mamluks turned and fled down the valley, dust billowing behind them. Kitbuqa grinned beneath his helmet. "Fools," he muttered, spurring his horse forward. "They run from their fate. After them," he roared. The command rippled through the ranks, and soon the valley filled with the sound of pursuit, the thunder of hooves, the screams of men, the rhythm of death approaching. The Mongols followed deeper into the gorge, their bloodlust blinding them to the danger. The hills on both sides seemed silent, lifeless. Only the faint echo of the chase remained. Then Baybars turned his horse sharply, glancing back once toward the distant ridgeline where Qutuz waited. A single banner lifted through the fog, black against the pale morning. That was the signal, and the valley erupted. From the hills, hidden Mamluk divisions burst forth like a rising tide. Trumpets blared. War drums thundered. Arrows rained down from every direction, blotting out the Sunday. Qutuz rode at the center, his armor glinting with the red hue of dawn. Now he shouted, his voice echoing through the chaos. "For your land, for your brothers," the Mamluks surged forward. Spears leveled horses, charging their formation like a wave of iron. They slammed into the flanks of the Mongol army, crushing their momentum. Kitbuqa realized too late. "Hold the line," he bellowed, swinging his sword, as his men fell around him. But the valley betrayed him. The narrow ground left no room to maneuver. His cavalry tangled together, trapped by their own numbers. Qutuz saw the hesitation and drove forward himself, his horse, cutting through the melee. The sound of clashing steel was deafening. He met Baybars at the center of the chaos, both men fighting shoulder to shoulder. "Now they bleed." Baybars growled, parrying a blow. Qutuz nodded, his face streaked with sweat and dust. "Don't stop until the valley is ours." The two armies collided again and again, the air thick with dust and smoke. Horses reared, men fell, blades shattered. The smell of sweat, blood, and burning earth filled the lungs of every man still standing. And above it all, the steady, unyielding heartbeat of war. Kitbuqa, surrounded, refused to retreat. "I am not done," he roared, slashing wildly until a spear struck his side. He stumbled, then fell from his horse as the ground swallowed him. Around him, the last of his warriors broke. The Mongol formation shattered. Those who could flee did so, chased by Mamluk lancers. Those who remained were cut down. When the dust finally began to settle, only the cries of the wounded remained. The once silent valley of Ain Jalut was now a graveyard of men and horses. Qutuz dismounted slowly, his legs trembling, his face pale but resolute. He looked around at the carnage, at the banner of the Mongols lying torn in the mud. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, softly, almost to himself, he whispered, "This is where the world changed." The echoes of battle still lingered in the valley, long after the swords had fallen silent. Smoke drifted over the field like a ghostly tide, curling through the wreckage of men and horses. The air was thick with the smell of ash, sweat, and iron. The sun climbing through the haze revealed the cost of victory, bodies strewn across the earth, banners torn, the once green valley now painted in shades of gray and red. At the center of it all stood Qutuz, his armor cracked, his face streaked with grime, his chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths as he surveyed the aftermath. Around him, the Mamluk soldiers moved in silence, not in triumph, but in awe. They had done what no army before them had achieved. The Mongols had been stopped. Nearby Baybars dismounted, pulling his helmet free. His hair was damp with sweat, his eyes hard and distant. He wiped his sword on a fallen Mongol's cloak before sheathing it. For a moment he said nothing, only listened to the wind, the crows, the faint groans of the dying. Then came a shout. General Wei found him. 2 soldiers dragged Kitbuqa forward, wounded but unbroken. The Mongol commander's armor was dented, his face pale, yet his eyes still burned with defiance. Qutuz stepped closer, his boots crunching against the debris. Kitbuqa glared at him. "You think this changes anything?" he rasped. "We are the storm. You cannot kill the wind." Qutuz looked down at the man who had brought ruin across half the world. "Every storm ends," he said quietly. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Kitbuqa was taken away, disappearing into the sea of tents and smoke. His capture marked the final blow. The valley of Ain Jalut belonged to the Mamluks. But there was no cheer, no celebration, only exhaustion. The kind that sinks deep into the soul. Baybars approached his steps slow, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said softly. Qutuz shook his head. "No, it's only begun." The 2 men stood side by side, watching the sky shift from gray to gold as the day wore on. The weight of what they had done hung between them. They had not just won a battle, they had altered the course of history. By dusk, word had already begun to spread. Riders carried the news across deserts and mountains, through cities that had once whispered only fear. The Mongols have been defeated. In Damascus, bells rang. In Jerusalem, candles were lit. And in Cairo, when the news reached the people, the city erupted in disbelief. Men wept openly in the streets. Women fell to their knees, thanking heaven for deliverance. The call to prayer that evening was louder than it had been in years, rising not from fear but from gratitude. Qutuz returned to Cairo days later, greeted by crowds that filled every street and rooftop. Flowers rained from balconies. The people shouted his name, calling him Savior, Deliverer, King. Yet as he passed through the city gates, his expression did not change. He knew fame was as fleeting as smoke. By his side, Baybars rode silently. He could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the cheers, the admiration, the whispers. Hero, they called him. But in his chest, something colder stirred. He had seen how power changed men, how quickly loyalty could become envy. That night, under the golden glow of Cairo's lamps, Baybars stood by the window of his quarters, staring out over the city. The streets pulsed with celebration, yet he felt only unease. He whispered to himself, "Victory breeds ambition, and ambition breeds betrayal." Across the courtyard, Qutuz knelt in quiet reflection. His thoughts were not of glory, but of the fallen names already fading beneath the tide of legend. He could still hear the screams of the dying, still see the faces of the men who had followed him into the valley and never returned. He closed his eyes and murmured, "May their courage outlive their names." Days turned to weeks. The bodies were buried, the wounds began to heal, but the silence that followed felt heavier than war itself. Ain Jalut became a symbol, a reminder that even the greatest empire could bleed. Yet peace in the Middle East was always fragile. Beneath the surface of triumph, politics stirred. Allies eyed one another with quiet suspicion. Ambition whispered behind closed doors. And though the Mongols had been driven back, their shadow still lingered on the horizon. Qutuz stood once more atop the citadel walls, gazing toward the distant desert. The night wind carried the faint scent of smoke from the city's torches below. Behind him, Baybars approached, stopping just a few steps away. "You should rest," Baybars said. Qutuz smiled faintly. "How can a man rest," he murmured, "when history has just changed?" Neither spoke again. The wind moved between them, cool and restless. For now, Cairo slept under a sky that finally seemed at peace, but every peace, as both men knew, is only a pause before the next storm. The wind over Ain Jalut carried a different sound now. No more the thunder of hooves or the clash of steel, only silence broken by the whisper of grass reclaiming the scarred earth. The valley that had once echoed with screams of war was at peace. The Mongol banners had fallen, their mighty army shattered. News of the defeat spread like wildfire across continents. From Damascus to Baghdad, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the steppes of Central Asia, men spoke the same words with disbelief. The Mongols have been stopped. For the first time in decades, the world had drawn a line the Mongols could not cross. Kitbuqa's death marked the beginning of a retreat that would never fully recover its momentum. The Mongol Empire, once unstoppable, hesitated. Its western expansion into the Islamic world was over. The storm had met the mountain, and the mountain had held. Under the rising banners of the Mamluk Sultanate, Egypt and Syria began to rebuild. Cities that had burned now flickered with new light. Markets reopened, scholars returned, and prayers once whispered in fear were spoken aloud again. The Mamluks had become more than soldiers, they were now a symbol. A symbol of resilience, unity, and the unbreakable will of a people who refused to vanish. In Cairo, the victory was celebrated as divine providence, but for Qutuz and Baybars, it had come with a heavy price. Every triumph carves its own shadow. Months after the victory, while returning from the northern campaign, Qutuz rode through the desert, weary yet hopeful. He had plans for a stronger Egypt, dreams of rebuilding what centuries of conquest had torn apart. But fate, as ever, was unpredictable. A blade flashed, a whisper of betrayal. The desert wind swallowed his final breath. When the dust settled, Baybars emerged as the new ruler of Egypt. The man who had once fought by Qutuz's side now held his crown. History would never agree on whether it was ambition, necessity, or destiny, but the throne passed and the Mamluk dynasty marched on under new command. Baybars proved to be as fierce in governance as he was in battle. He rebuilt the military, fortified the cities, and restored trade along the old routes of the East. Under his rule, Cairo flourished as the beating heart of the Middle East, a city of scholars, artisans, and warriors. For a time, the Mamluk Sultanate shone brighter than any kingdom around it, but Baybars carried the weight of his choices, like armor he could never remove. Victory had given him power, but power came with ghosts, Qutuz among them. At night, when the palace corridors grew quiet, he would look toward the desert and remember the man who had once led him into fire. Still, he ruled with iron resolve. The Mongols never returned to Syria in such strength again. The memory of Ain Jalut had burned itself into their legend, a warning written in defeat. Years turned to decades, yet the story endured. Fathers told it to sons, poets wrote it into song. The Battle of Ain Jalut became more than history, it became a lesson. That courage can bloom even in the ashes of fear. That even the smallest force, when united, can stand against the impossible. That destiny favors not the strongest empire, but the bravest heart. As centuries passed, scholars would still look back at that September morning and say it was the moment the world turned. History remembers the Mongols as conquerors, the storytellers say. But it remembers Ain Jalut as the moment the world pushed back. Now, imagine the scene one last time. The valley quiet, the smoke gone, the air clean and new, the echo of hooves fading into memory. The world, for the first time in years, exhaling. The Mamluks would rise and fall as all powers do. Empires would come and go, their glories forgotten. But the spirit of Ain Jalut, the defiance, the unity, the will to stand would outlive them all. Because in that valley history learned a truth, he would never forget that courage, even from those once enslaved, can halt the march of empires. And so as the story closes, the narrator's voice softens, the sound of wind through the grass, the faint clink of distant armor fading away, and a final question remains. If one act of courage could change history, what could yours do?